Hey folks, I wanted to talk now in more detail about the specifics of the U.S. monetary system, to go through what the Federal Reserve System really is. And I talked about in the introduction this concept of debt money, which I'll explain in more detail in a different video because there's a lot more to what really backs the debt monetary system. But I talked about banks issuing money as an asset to themselves and a debt to the people. And this is a world of sort of people on one side and capital on the other, and capital interests, the people that serve capital, on this side of the world. What I didn't mention yet is that the money for the people is attached to interest, and it has to be paid back, all of it. So this is sort of pure private sector monetary system, where you would have rich people forcing other people to go into debt to them, working for them, giving them value, return on capital. But of course now we have governments as well. Let's say the U.S. government up here, which has its own balance sheet, and states, of course, which have their balance sheet. Now, the U.S. government was supposed to control money and regulate its value, according to Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. That's the government's explicit role. But they don't. All they can get is debt. Over here on the liability side of their balance sheet. And same with the states. All the states can get is debt. And they have so much debt now that they're pretty much out of business. They're not states anymore. They're administrative districts of the capital machine. And it's just a matter of time before the same dynamic happens with nations. So when the government wasn't doing its job, you had local banks that could engage in their own practices of inflating and deflating. So you might have a local bank in Des Moines, Iowa, serving local farmers, like corn farmers in Iowa, and the bank might be run by capital holders in London or New York. But the bank could inflate the market and then deflate it and drive all the farmers off the land, collect the land for the banks and the capital machine, and then sell it off to doctors and lawyers and MBAs, the people that serve the capital machine, or the people that get paid by the capital machine. And that's exactly what happened. That's how the Midwestern farming industry was restructured and taken out of the hands of farmers. So the farmers are now nothing but tenants on land held by lawyers and business people. And while the Des Moines bank was inflating, you might have a bank in Philadelphia or Orlando or wherever deflating or doing whatever they wanted with their own notes and their own banking practices, inflating and deflating. And so it was chaos. It was constant booms and busts on a regional basis and multiple currencies. And so the people, the states, and the government all realized the need for a regulatory system. They basically realized the need for the government, for the feds to do their job according to Article 1, but of course they didn't, and so we had this thing called the Fed. And the Fed would have most people believe that it sits on this side of the world and it just regulates the money pumped out by the government. That's kind of the common misconception that most people have. The government prints money and the Fed controls the quantity. Doesn't happen at all. Hasn't happened. Well, it never happened under the Fed. In fact, it's the exact opposite. The Fed is a mechanism by which the government is put in debt to control the people, because the Fed really doesn't sit on this side of the world. The real power of it sits on this side of the world. The Fed sits on both. It's really a sort of a fascist organization between big government and the big capital interests. But the power is in the 18 primary dealer cartel banks. Those are the biggest banks in the United States. JP Morgan Chase, that's the main bank. That's the Fed bank. That's the bank with the real power. Goldman Sachs, really powerful bank. Morgan Stanley, Bank of America, Citibank, the big banks in Britain, Barclays or HSBC, the British Empire's foothold in Hong Kong and China, RBC, the foothold in Canada, RBS, foothold in Scotland, Deutsche Bank in Germany, BNP Paribas in France, the big banks in Switzerland, and the big banks in Japan. Japan? What's Japan doing in this cartel? Well, that's the end result of World War II was conquering Japan, conquering Germany, restructuring Germany such that it was forced into the Anglo-American banking alliance. That's the real result of World War II, and of course it brought in the rest of Europe as well. And so this global cartel, this cartel that's basically in what people would call the north region of the world and the west region of the world. It's the north and the west, and they've been the growth engine through the 20th century. So it's a very powerful cartel, a very powerful monetary system with a very powerful currency. The people that claim the dollar is backed by nothing and it's just worthless paper couldn't be further from the truth. You don't get the most powerful empire in history based off worthless crap. So I'll get into that in a future video as well, because that really needs to be corrected. You need to understand what's behind the dollar. So all these banks have their own balance sheet, and they issue money to themselves, just like other banks do, as an asset, and they inject it through the corporate system as a debt to the corporations, or they inject it to the government as a debt to the government, and that is what's called a bond on the big bank's balance sheet. And of course, these are the private sector banks that engage in that business, and then you have the central banks of the world, the Bank of China, the Bank of Japan, Bank of England, that do this as well, and they buy the bonds from the U.S. government. So basically a huge global cartel of capital holding the U.S. government hostage. They have a big gun pointed at the head of the U.S. government. And that gun forces the U.S. government to milk the people and farm the people for the capital system. So not only are the people being sucked over here through the commercial banking operation, but also being funneled up through here, through the government, and over to the cartel, by the government being forced to go into debt to the banks. So it's a huge farming operation where the people engage in work. They're the ones creating real value. They're the ones sweating, commuting, doing jobs they generally don't like, to serve the capital machine that needs its debt paid off, or needs to collect on its debt. So that's the dynamic of this monetary system, where massive monetary flows are flowing from here over to here. And then it gets injected back throughout the world, because again, it's a global monetary cartel. And a lot of it might come right back into the United States, especially in the high-tech sector, as it gets sucked, as high-tech products get sucked through the corporate system, and the corporate system's getting capital injection from here. They'll inject it back through Hollywood, of course. It's really important for them to control the minds of the people. And they'll inject it, of course, through the U.S. government, because they need the government to engage in war, to restructure the world in the way that this capital machine wants it restructured. And of course, they make massive money off of war. So those are the primary things that receive liquidity, receive capital injections. And the people are forced to work for one of those sectors in order to have money. It only gets injected through limited sectors where the capital machine wants it, and then the rest of it is injected now, as you know, into the rest of the world, as we've seen the corporate system move production in China and Brazil and India. And we see these banks injecting liquidity. You know, most of these banks are international anyway, so they're taking liquidity and value from the U.S. and injecting it into their home countries and into other countries around the world to build the global capital machine. That's the monetary system of the United States, folks. There's no sovereignty here, no sovereignty here, and no sovereignty here. The only sovereignty is over here, at this side of the world, where the system is designed to make money and increase power. Over here, everything is managed basically as a cost center, where money is reduced and power is reduced over time. And then you have the elite banks also controlling not only the governments, states, and people, but also the smaller banks, because they package up a bunch of crap called toxic assets and derivatives and types of things that you've heard about in the last couple of years, and they force it onto the balance sheets of the smaller banks, all the rest of the banks in the U.S. So it's a hierarchical monetary system, where the elite system has control over basically everything. There are still some small banks that aren't under this cartel's control, but just wait till the next phase of the crisis, and you'll see the government dutifully coming in, because the gun to its head, taking, seizing the small banks and basically absorbing them, forcing them to be absorbed into the big banks. And then there's one state bank, North Dakota, that's not part of this system either. And of course, it's one of the soundest banks in the country now because it's not controlled by the private capital holders that have been removing liquidity from the system.